Sheikh Hasina flees Bangladesh. Violence and arson grip the country. Bangladesh army installs interim government. Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, new ruler. Pakistan to Sri Lanka to Bangladesh. India's neighbourhood is in turmoil. Region caught in global power play. Has South Asia become a ring of fire? South Asia Roundtable.
Hello and welcome to this week's Roundtable. It's been a week where India, South Asia and the world has been stunned by the dramatic images coming out of Bangladesh. Arson, looting, targeted killings and the fleeing eventually of the country's longest-serving Prime Minister are yet another reminder of the turbulent neighbourhood we live in. As the latest India Today cover magazine story suggests, we find ourselves in what they call a circle of fire. Street agitations, overthrow of governments, unstable governments, military rule. Should India be worried? That's the big talking point as we bring together guests from across South Asia. That's right, we have a very unique South Asia Roundtable. Joining me in the studio is Raj Chengappa, Group Editorial Director at India Today. Also joining us, Barrister Sara Hussain. She's a UN expert. She's also based in Dhaka, so she's at the epicenter of all that's happened. I'm joined by Ambassador Omar Samad, former Afghan diplomat, joins me. Aisha Siddiqa is a leading author and joining me at the moment. She will give us a Pakistani perspective. She's based in London. Jehan Pereira is Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka, Colombo. And KC Singh is former Secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs. So we managed to really bring people from across the region. I want to turn to you, Sara Hussain, first, because you're where the violence has taken place, our immediate news peg for all that's happened. I know an interim government has been sworn in, but give our viewers a sense of how you view what's happened in the last week, 10 days in Bangladesh.
If I could start by saying, I think your characterization and description of what's happened here seems chronologically rather peculiar, because what we've seen in Bangladesh over the last 2 months, starting from June and heating up in July, was a very peaceful student protest right across the country over an issue that could have been resolved through political negotiation and discussion, which a kind of issue which you've had in India also, and where you've also had violence, in fact, following where those kinds of actions have happened, about quotas and about reservations for government jobs. However, that peaceful student movement was responded to with direct live fire and killings of, at the moment, as far as we know, more than 300 people, perhaps many more than that. Bodies have not yet been counted. There are still morgues and hospitals where we still don't have the records. I visited a graveyard today where they're still compiling the data of the dead who came in during the days of the firing on protesters. So I think it's not right for you to start by saying arson, looting, and turmoil and turbulence. It happened because there were shootings on citizens involved in peaceful protest. That's been followed. That's been followed by the fall and the fleeing to India of Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister. And subsequent to that, the taking charge of an interim government headed by Professor Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel awardee. Now, that's the situation we're in. And since Sheikh Hasina fled, she fled from the prime ministerial residence. She fled without any arrangements being made for any of her party members, for any other ministers, for any other person in any part of the administration at all. She fled without any arrangements being made by the military for the security of ordinary citizens. This is not an unprecedented situation in that we have had previous heads of government toppled through popular movements. We've had that happen in 1990 where General Irshad fell, and General Irshad fell after a peaceful transition which was negotiated with him, and where he stepped down and he handed over power to the person who was the former Chief Justice, who took over as the caretaker advisor. It's important for you to be aware that all of the valves that were in our constitution for peaceful transfer through a caretaker government were annulled by Sheikh Hasina's government while she was in power. So she left without any arrangements for anybody. And following that situation, the police, who had been until that moment firing on protesters, until that morning, we are still representing young women lawyers who were held in the police station just near the epicenter of the protests in Shahbag in the middle of Dhaka. They were being beaten with rods and sticks up until 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the 5th of August. Sheikh Hasina fled around about 1:30, 2 o'clock. Right. That's the situation we were in. So I think you really do need to recharacterize you're depicting what's happened in Bangladesh. What has happened since the 5th of August, if I may have one more moment, yes. What has happened since the 5th of August and since Sheikh Hasina's departure, after those 3 or 4 hours of euphoria when people were on the streets and celebrating her departure, we saw a different situation emerging. There were reprisal killings, reprisal attacks, on members of the Awami League. There have also been targeted attacks, it seems, on members of minorities, the Ahmadiyya community, the Hindu community, members of the Christian community also. And in the last day, we've also been hearing very disturbing attacks. I've just heard about an attack on a professor who also seems to have been attacked by some sort of extremist elements. But that's happened because we're in a situation which was left with no arrangements for what happens when somebody flees the country who's been the head of the government. It's a completely, more than an unfortunate, a deeply disturbing situation we've been in for the last 3 days, where there hasn't been law and order on the ground. The police said they refused to cooperate. We had very few military on the street for the first few days. Now we have slightly larger numbers. But we're also facing a situation where all of the institutions of state, it's not just a question of parliament not being here, but all of the institutions of state have been deeply politically polarized and deeply controlled by the Awami League. And so we're also seeing a situation where there's huge resistance to allowing a peaceful transition of power. So it's a very dangerous and difficult situation, but I think we need to be clear about what's happening here. It's not just random mobs running around for days and days on end and nothing else happening.
I'll come back to you, Sara. You've tried to sort of give us your perspective of how you see it from the ground, and we respect that because often distance prevents us perhaps from understanding the complexity of what's happening at the moment in your country. And we wanted to start this off from Bangladesh because that's been the trigger for today's roundtable. And I want to raise the big questions, therefore. What makes South Asia so trouble-prone? Is South Asia caught, as some suggest, in a global power play? Why is democracy not taking root in some parts of the region? Is this now a region still plagued by coups, revolts, by fanaticism and extremism? Has South Asia therefore become, as we are calling it, a circle or a ring of fire? These are some of the questions that we will continue to pose, but Sara Hussain has put it in some perspective for us, and I want to broaden this, Raj Chengappa, since it's your magazine that has called it a circle of fire. Sara says, don't look at this purely as from the point of view of the arson and the looting that you've seen. It is also a popular revolt against seemingly an autocratic ruler who did not allow democratic institutions, checks and balances to flourish. Let's not describe, she says, the students as arsonists and looters.
I think, Rajdeep, we have to look just not at Bangladesh and see the kind of troubled neighborhood that we have. We saw the same scenes play out in 2022 in Sri Lanka, for instance. And I mean, it's almost like a mirror image that in Colombo you have the presidential palace being ransacked, and here you have the Prime Minister's house doing it. You look across at Pakistan, and you've had for the first time the Pakistan army has been challenged in terms of the fact that you had the Imran supporters actually storm the co-commander's house in Lahore. You go towards Myanmar and you have a rebellion that has seen almost the junta that is ruling there losing almost half its territory to the rebels. And wherever you look, one of the things that come across is, to answer your question, is that there is economic issues of serious concern, and there is an aspirational youth And there's a youth bulge in most of these countries, particularly in India, that is unhappy with the way things are going. So if you see what happens in Bangladesh, it's a highly prosperous country till COVID strikes. And its economy is dependent on remittances, its economy is dependent on exports. All that begins to crumble, and you have high unemployment, you have high inflation, and discontent begins to spread. Compare also with the kind of authoritarian rule which bottles up everything. Take Sri Lanka, the same problem. You had, the Rajapaksa family have a stranglehold of it, and then the entire economy collapses. So I think the big message that is coming up there is two things. One, that these days there is tremendous amount, the power is flowing from youth themselves who are very, very unhappy. Regimes across cannot afford to take the people for granted. And what we are seeing is the complete economic discontent caused partly by COVID, caused by very bad governance, dictatorships, and other kinds of things that's happened in, in South Asia.
You know, as I said, we'll try and explore as many facets of it. Ambassador Omar Samad, you're joining us to give us an Afghanistan perspective, because a few years ago we saw Afghanistan as the epicenter of much of the violence, the fanaticism that resulted in the loss of thousands of lives, the upsurge of terror. Give us your sense as you look across the region. Are you seeing that fanaticism, the extremism, the violence that can be triggered at the slightest moment deeply troubling?
Well, let me just say that I, first of all, appreciate very much the viewpoint that was given from the ground in Bangladesh. I think that is very important. As a student of foreign policy, as a student of geopolitics, geoeconomics, security issues, someone who has dealt with Afghanistan issues for more than 40 years of my life, at some point as a diplomat, I will tell you that there are a lot of lessons that we have to learn. And one of them has to do with dealing with ground realities and taking reality into account in context that we hope will shape not only a country's future, but also the region and the dynamics that it plays globally as well. So in the context of Afghanistan, as you mentioned, almost 3 years ago, we saw another president over there who was very unpopular, whose governance was mired in corruption, and who couldn't end a civil war that had started many years ago, and didn't take advantage of the opportunities that existed. As was mentioned earlier, it's very important to aim for a political settlement when a political settlement is available or the opportunity exists. If you fail, if you miss that opportunity, then the country may head in the wrong direction or in a direction that is undesirable for some. But in the context of Afghanistan, the lesson was we had an opportunity to end that war, ask the Americans and NATO to leave peacefully, and have a transition that was acceptable to most Afghans and that would not create the situation that it has created now, where everything is in one hand. Okay. And the whole country is under one command, without much participation by others. So we failed, and we learned the lesson. I think others have their own dynamics. I mean, Bangladesh is not Afghanistan, Pakistan is not Afghanistan, India is not Sri Lanka. Every country has its own domestic internal dynamics. But then there's the regional dynamic, and then there is the global, if you want, sort of
I'm going to stop you.
Rivalry.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you for a moment. I'm going to stop you for a moment, and I'll request my guests to be as short as possible because we want to get in as many viewpoints there. Jehan Pereira, there in Sri Lanka, a lot of the images we saw in Bangladesh this week were very similar to what we saw in Sri Lanka just a little over a year or two ago. And the sense is the economic discontent that Mr. Chengappa spoke about is also been reflected in your country. It resulted in anger on the streets. And that's the boiling point. Across South Asia, there are groups who feel left out. And then when you have authoritarian figures who seemingly are impervious to those concerns, people now take to the streets. Is this a pattern that we are now seeing where people are saying, if you don't give us enough democratic outlets, we will come on the street and challenge whoever rules us?
Well, in Sri Lanka, the people came out on the streets 2 years after elections, democratic elections, at which people freely chose the leaders they wanted. The problem was that those leaders failed. and to deliver the economic prosperity that people expected. And on the contrary, there were these enormous shortages of fuel and food and foreign exchange. And people came out on the street. For 2 months, it was actually quite peaceful. They peacefully protested, wanting the government to resign. And the violence actually started when the government itself deployed thugs to attack the protesters. At which point, after 2 months of peaceful protest, then there was the violence that took place for a very short time. But that again was resolved when Sri Lanka was able to appoint a new president through parliament, and not through the Democrat, not through people's vote, but through parliament. And that president was able to restore peace and calm very fast. He used the security forces. There were human rights violations. There were excesses, but very few people died in that. And now Sri Lanka is, in a way, we are looking forward to election. Now, 2 years later, we are looking forward to presidential elections. September 21st is the date. And it's quite calm now, peaceful, and there's a lot of optimism that after the elections...
You're saying the worst is over. The worst is over in that sense in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka looks optimistically to the future. I'm going to bring in Aisha Siddiqa, because can Pakistan look optimistically to the future? You've got a leader, a very popular leader in Imran Khan, who spent more than a year now behind bars. You've had elections. But the question is, are these elections legitimate in the eyes of the public? That's the problem. Hasina also could claim she had an election, but the general belief was it wasn't free and fair in the case of Bangladesh. Even in the case of Pakistan, when your most popular leader and his party is kept out of the election, how do you expect people to respond when these democratic outlets are being constantly constrained?
Well, let me firstly come and say something that, if you were referring to earlier, you were referring to May 9th and when people came out. They did not attack, per se, the Corps Commander's residence in Lahore. In fact, the Corps Commander who was there allowed them, let them come in, and there's a confusion. And I think May 9th happened partly because of division within the military. There were those who supported Imran Khan and who did not want the traditional political parties, the PMLN, Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, and the Pakistan People's Party led by Asif Ali Zardari to come in. So there was a division within the military itself, and people kind of benefited from it. Of course, there was violence, but it was limited kind of violence. People were not, nobody died in those protests. Now, the fact is that there is a lot of resentment in Pakistan regarding the 2024 elections. People think that the mandate has been stolen from them. So far, in Punjab and Sindh, which are the two major areas where, in terms of population, more than 50% of Pakistan's population is in Punjab, and it's very critical, and it's also the power center. But the problem is that there's still not demonstrations. People are very unhappy. I mean, given a choice and what they want, I mean, there is this constant pressure. The military feels it, and there is this, kind of a tussle, a political tussle, a psychological tussle, which is going on. People are coming out, people are speaking against the military, people are very unhappy, and that unhappiness is being felt, within the military as well. But is that pressure enough? Unless people come out on the streets is the next question. I mean, unless people come out on the streets, it will not impress the military echelons to kind of withdraw and allow Imran Khan out of jail, or allow him, allow holding of another elections. Imran Khan says he doesn't accept these election results.
But the fact is, therefore, that you've got, from all that we've heard so far, KC Singh, let's be honest, we are in this country, in India, which has had an election just a couple of months ago, but a relatively peaceful transition from Narendra Modi 2.0 to Narendra Modi 3.0. Yes, there are agitations that take place from time to time. Is India an oasis in this turbulent neighborhood? Would I be right in suggesting that today?
I think each country has a different story. In Maldives, you had a peaceful transition. We may not like the nature of the transition and President Bush coming in and tilting them towards China, but it was a peaceful transition, although one of the former presidents is in jail. In Sri Lanka, as just pointed out, people did come out, but they found a solution within the parliament. They didn't go to the streets and the student leaders tell the army chief to appoint X as the president. Now that is very peculiar. But then what is the lesson we are learning? Why blame these countries? Look what happened in America. That is still not settled what happened on January 6th, 2021. There's a mob that overran the Capitol Hill. And Trump still doesn't believe in it, and he wants to be president again. So the lesson is that when there's high degree of polarization, and there is not an easy transfer of power, and there are repressive measures, you shut all avenues of venting feelings, then sooner or later there'll be an explosion. So we don't know at what stage the students marching peacefully in Dhaka were taken over by political parties or their supporters and turned into a mass mob. At some stage, the transition occurred. To simply say that because they fired at them, that may be true, that there were repressive measures because those have worked in the past.
No, but is India an oasis? Very quickly, KC Singh, can India really consider itself a relative oasis within this turbulent neighborhood? Yes or no?
No, I don't call it. As I just told you, Maldives is not turbulent. We may not like the outcome, but being a huge country, we may not always be. And the problem is internal and external. External is there is a competition between India and China going on this entire region. So there are leaders like in Nepal who will play India against China, and they will try controlling the political system there accordingly. Same thing is happening in Maldives. We saw it happen earlier under Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka. And in Dhaka, we turned a blind eye to what was happening there because we were very happy with the politics that Sheikh Hasina was conducting. Now, if you allow, even the Americans were critical. Right. They said after the election it was neither free nor fair. But we remained absolutely mute. Now, if you tie yourself, if you allow a situation to build up, I don't say the region is this thing, but you also have a role to play.
Okay,
you have to understand where you also have a responsibility.
I'll come to India's role. I'll come to India's role in a moment, but I just want to turn back to Bangladesh where we started off, because Sara Hussain, you heard KC Singh suggest that, look, the fact is, does Bangladesh or do the Bangladeshi people acknowledge that what's happened in the last few weeks is a continuation of what's happened over the last 15 years. There have been arguments that the elections have not been free and fair. The last 2-3 elections have not been free and fair. And there was no outlet that people had to challenge, in a way, Sheikh Hasina. It took this popular movement over over quotas to eventually end in a street protest and then violence. When I said at the outset arson, looting, and targeted killings, the fear is that such movements can get taken over by vested groups. Is that something that should trouble Bangladesh, or do you believe democracy there is stable enough for these movements to be eventually accommodated?
Again, with respect to Mr. Singh, I think the issue is that we had a peaceful movement, as the Sri Lankans also described had happened in Sri Lanka, which ended in Bangladesh's case in a bloodbath perpetrated by state agents, by the police associated with non-state agents who were members of the ruling party, the youth wing and the student wing of Sheikh Hasina's Awami League. It's not a matter of my arguing it. There's enormous amounts of evidence all over, everywhere. And I think it's also important at this point to mention that
But Sara, what happened? But what happened subsequently? You know, that...
Yeah, I'm coming to what happened subsequently. I just want to speak about what Mr. Singh said. First of all, you both spoke about the relative stability in India, but we don't see the situation in Bangladesh that we've seen in India of peaceful human rights activists like the BK16 being incarcerated for years on end under laws that all Indian human rights activists and constitution lawyers describe as deeply repressive. We've not seen that kind of situation in peacetime. We've not seen the lynching of Hindus or Christians or Ahmadis or any other minorities in peacetime, meaning not in this kind of protest situation and firing on protesters, right? We haven't seen that in Bangladesh. We've seen actually a different situation, which has been quite extreme and ongoing and quiet repression, total silencing of people. We have laws in Bangladesh still in place, made by the last government, that allow for imprisonment of any person who says anything which is considered inimical of the Prime Minister, the father of the nation, or history. You can't comment on history without potentially being locked up for 10 or 14 years. That's the situation we've lived in over here. And it's extremely unfortunate that seasoned Indian diplomats and commentators have simply not bothered to comment on that reality of repression that has existed here. Bangladesh is doing well economically. We also accept that, and we're responsible for that in Bangladesh. It's not one prime minister or one government that has brought that about. It's happened over a period of time. But what is not acceptable is for India, I think, to be looking at us, or for Indian commentators, I don't know about the Indian government, but those of you who are here, to say Bangladesh is somehow just a turbulent mess, just a bunch of uncivilized people who fight with sticks and kill each other.
No, Sarah, I don't think we said that.
No,
I don't think we said that. What we did... No, but when you say that... No, but the repression that's taken place in Bangladesh, are you saying India had to, in a way, sort of speak out against it, that India should have spoken out against Sheikh Hasina?
It's not a question of speaking out against the Sheikh Hasina. It's about calling what you see as the truth. That has not happened. India has simply chosen to look away. And I think that's true of the kind of reporting we've seen is looking away from what has actually been happening here for years and years. You talk about possibly unfair elections. We've had 2 rounds of elections where there hasn't been effective participation, where the rest of the world's media seems to have found it possible to understand that real elections didn't happen in Bangladesh. It's not even parliamentary elections.
No, sure, but you see, in India at the moment, for example, India at the moment is concerned about targeted attacks on minorities in Bangladesh. Should India not raise those issues?
Excuse me, Bangladeshis are concerned about targeted attacks on minorities. I don't see you, Rajdeep, running to Dhaka and Madaripur and Faridpur. Bangladeshis are running there, and Bangladeshi students, Bangladeshi civil society, Bangladeshi lawyers, Bangladeshi journalists are running to these places to make sure that our fellow citizens are protected. It's not only Hindus who are being attacked here. It's Ahmadiyya Muslims have been attacked. Individual civil society people have also been attacked because they've been perceived as having been affiliated with or enabling, various... We've seen journalists here who have also been involved in telling untruths about what the government has done for years on end and benefiting from it. Getting benefits, getting contracts. So people have turned against them. None of that turning against them is right. The reprisals are not right. And the point is Bangladeshis are standing by other Bangladeshis. And I think the other last point I'd like to make, Rajdeep, is we've seen the most extraordinary amount of disinformation right around India in particular, and by Indians abroad. For example, it's wonderful to see you here. We haven't met for 30 years since we were both in Oxford. I've received messages this week from other Indian friends I also haven't seen since Oxford days, asking me if I'd like to take shelter in Bombay and Delhi. I don't need to do that. There are many hundreds and millions of people in Bangladesh who don't need to take shelter and who are trying to help provide shelter to those who need it. So we can ensure that we have law and order in Bangladesh and we can continue, with peace and prosperity. That's what we need to do at this point.
Sarah sets the debate up well, because what is India's role here? You see, we seem to see ourselves as the big brother in the neighborhood, in a neighborhood where we haven't held a SAARC summit now in more than a decade. And there is Sarah saying that where was India when there was repression in Bangladesh, when the elections were not free and fair? Why were we not speaking out? Now suddenly you see these images, you see instances where minority groups, Hindus are targeted, and suddenly we are all incensed. We should have been incensed a long time ago, is what she says. Others will say India has a hands-off policy at the moment in South Asia. We do not want to intervene in the region. Maybe as a result, China is stepping in where India is not.
Well, Rajdeep, to answer her question, yes, it is for India what happened in Bangladesh, a strategic and diplomatic setback. Its name has been tarnished. The policy that we adopted, there could have been very good reasons as to why we, endured Hasina's reign. We were concerned about, anti-Indian elements, which she thwarted. We actually built relations with her in terms of settling the land dispute as well as trade and connectivity. There were a lot of pluses, and we had kept China at bay because there was always this fear that they would come into the Bay of Bengal. But I think what we need, the lessons from this is that we need a total revamp of our neighborhood first policy. It is too security oriented and as a
Is
result.
it too individual-centric that we put all our eggs in Hasina's basket, for example? We didn't put our eggs in the people of Bangladesh. We don't put our eggs in the people of Sri Lanka. We focus on Rajapaksa, we focus on Hasina, and then when things go wrong, we're suddenly caught off guard. Is that a lesson in a way for India as we look at this turbulent neighborhood?
Absolutely. I think we need to recalibrate our policy on this matter. The fact is that if you take a look at what we did either in Lanka, which was a very great success, subsequently we went ahead and gave financial aid to them, and you can see the mood change that is there, that they look upon us in a far friendlier manner that is there. So there's a lesson there that you can come into a crisis situation and actually come out looking better. Not that we were involved in that particular thing. In terms of Bangladesh and in others, the playbook that we need to start moving towards is how can we see greater integration economically? Because once you build, otherwise what happens is, there are deep political cleavages. And when you see, if you take one side, as I said, you put all your eggs in one basket, one of the things is we need to make sure that we are talking to all other parties as well. In Myanmar, for example, we should be doing that. We didn't do that in Maldives. We should have kept the thing. So that's one thing that you need to do. It's very difficult time because, the whole problem here is that leaders are so dependent on their elections that if they don't win it, they go to jail. So there's this extreme sort of behavior that is happening that we need to take cognizance of. But clearly, India needs to move in terms of not just security issues that we had focused on in our playbook, to really economic serious. You talked of SARC. We talked of BIMSTEC, which was the other formation that we did to avoid China and Pakistan. We haven't had, in 20 years, we've had only 5 summits. So we have neglected the economic front, which I think we need to focus on.
Let me bring in Ashraf Haidari. He's an Afghan envoy to Sri Lanka, and he'll give us again an Afghan perspective, because Afghanistan again has been seen as a turbulent neighborhood, as part of this turbulent neighborhood. Your sense, do you believe, and I raised this issue earlier, that there are forces out there which are making it more and more difficult for the kind of integration that Raj Chengappa speaks about here? Is it really possible to economically interconnect a region with such sharp political cleavages? We don't recognize the Taliban. Someone else will not recognize the government, the junta in Burma, in Myanmar. How do you then bring all these countries together in any cohesive formation?
It's really a challenge, I think, for all these countries, and that's why SARC was established with a vision to bring the countries of the region on a shared platform to help address some of the common challenges now evolved since the establishment of SARC to address them, very much based on lessons to have been learned from post-World War II Europe. But unfortunately, that's not where South Asia is, and given increased interstate tensions, which has played out not only in Bangladesh, but of course in Afghanistan. We saw that between Pakistan and in India, which very much victimized the people of Afghanistan and the young democracy, unfortunately. And today for India, of course, much as it was discussed, India has abandoned the people of Afghanistan, more or less now engaging with the Taliban, which by no way serves India's interests on the short and long term, given geopolitical tensions and rivalries. And as a result, we know also that across the region, it's a state of fragility, corrupt elite, poverty, and unemployment, and as well as exclusive growth, which then lead to popular grievances exploited and then by internal political opportunists and external strategic actors, which could use proxies. And we've seen that in case of Afghanistan. So here, I think major players such as India should have a two-pronged approach. One, doing its own homework much in advance to help prevent situations from happening, as we have seen in Bangladesh, but also to align with other countries in the region in order to ensure continental stability. Because at the end of the day, look, China and India have shared interests when it comes to, stability and their own periphery for any number of reasons. And that's why India is also in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a platform that whose principal goal is to ensure stability and security in the wider region, so that these rising powers continue rising, on the one hand compete, but on the other hand cooperate where their interests collide. I think Bangladesh was one place where India and China could have cooperated.
Okay, I'll come to the China factor in a moment, but there's also the India-Pakistan. You see, for the longest time, Aisha Siddiqa, it was the India-Pakistan diplomatic war, military wars that seem to hold back this region from actually integrating or finding some kind of a common economic market or some interconnectedness. Now we've reached a stage where there seems to be a frozen turbulence between these two large countries at the moment. Should that worry us or not? India simply seems to have decided we can't do business anymore with Pakistan because we do not trust Pakistan. The trust deficit is so deep with Pakistan that in a way prevents us from actually even thinking of any kind of South Asian neighborhood or neighborliness.
Raj, the thing is that there are, two dimensions of the issue. And I think that you're looking at it just from one. Of course, there is a trust deficit between India and Pakistan, and it's at both ends. Not that India doesn't trust Pakistan, Pakistan doesn't trust India either. And the problem is not just about the unresolved dispute, the Kashmir issue, etc. The problem is much more. I mean, here you have a regime for the, which has been there, for more than 2 elections, which does operations inside Pakistan as well, inside other countries as well, and then comes and boasts about it and says, ghus ke mara, we entered and we killed. I mean, it owns up to terror attacks as well. This is a problem. And I'm not saying that this kind of operations did not happen before.
Yeah, but I didn't want. But there is cross-border terror. I mean, how does India then, every time there is this approach, India seems at one level to worry about Pakistan only through now the prism of cross-border terrorism. You end terror, and maybe then things can you can build from there.
You see, but there is no conversation happening. There is no conversation happening. There is no back channel happening. And unless you talk, I mean, even if Pakistan is a very naughty neighbor and not behaving itself, the Pakistan's perspective is that, India is also doing similar things, and the government in Delhi is boasting about it. It's not that it's hiding it as it was done in the past. It's boasting about it. So where do you have the conversation? So that conversation is not going anywhere, and I don't see a conversation moving. However, what gives me a bit of kind of peace of mind is that certain agreements, like the agreement on the on the line of control, it continues to be followed by both countries. So in one respect, there is this silent, but a stable instability or unstable stability, which you have between the two countries, which is good enough for the moment. But how to move the conversation, how to move the relation to a second phase where we start talking trade. Now, the problem is at both ends. I mean, of course, there is a problem in Pakistan as well, with its politics so unstable at the moment. I don't think that either trade with India or peace with India is something on which Islamabad can move forward.
Okay, I'm trying to get my guests to be short. I know these are complex issues, and therefore you need to expound on them in greater detail. But KC Singh, how do you see this? Therefore, is the whole idea of South Asia regional cooperation dead? Every time, all you can now do is have stronger bilateral relationships in the neighborhood. find ways in which you work with people, build economic relationships with specific countries. The SARC concept is over. In such a turbulent neighborhood, it's going to be impossible. We can do it on TV, but we can't do it institutionally. Our diplomats simply can't sit around a table anymore. Our leaders cannot sit around a table anymore.
When SARC was created, I was in Rashtrapati Bhavan. Gyani Zail Singh, as you know, was the president. And Kebal Singh was the former foreign secretary. He came to meet him. And Gyani asked him, he says, you know, what is this SARC? You know, when you are the sarpanch of the village, you know, you don't want a panchayat because they'll all gang up against you. I mean, that was common sense. That it's going to be very difficult dealing with the neighborhood, even when SARC was created. Listen, the neighborhood will always have variations because each country is not going to be on the same level or on the same thing where you can deal with them at the same time. Now, take Nepal. Then used to be the king of Nepal was there. We had difficulties with him. In Dhaka, this is not the first time we're having difficulties. We had military rule. General Ziaur Rahman came in and he tilted away from India. They were working with Jamaat-e-Islami and we had all kinds of difficulties with Bangladesh. So you will have these ups and downs in the neighborhood. Even the Americans are not always able to control all their allies, all the way they want. See what happened in Iran. Once Shah of Iran went, even till today, the relationship between America and Iran is not normal. Because when you're that close to an authoritarian leader and the leader falls, then you inherit all his difficulties. And I think that's what we are facing. So the lessons are that do not align that closely for such a long time with somebody becoming that authoritarian or control him or give them advice that this is not the route. Or you...
No, I think you make a very good point, Jayan Pereira. Even in Sri Lanka, there was a feeling for a while that we had hitched our bandwagon onto the Rajapakshas. And then when they were out of the scene, it took some time to get the relationship back on an even keel with Sri Lanka. But I want to explore with you and start with you the China factor, because that really is the other power play that's going on. There's a sense that China wants to expand its influence from the Maldives to Lanka to Bangladesh to parts. Is that a factor at all in the turbulence that we see around us? Or is this all purely internal? All the turbulence is internal unrest in each of these countries.
I mean, in my view, India followed the neighborhood first policy very well in Sri Lanka. During our worst period, when we had that economic collapse, when there was a shortage of everything, it was India that stepped in and supported us in a way we never imagined. And I think, I mean, Sri Lankans are very grateful for that. Of course, at the same time, we do remember how in the 1980s, India promoted the Tamil insurrection also. That is also there in our minds. But what India did during the period of the economic collapse is something we are very much appreciative of. And I think that this thought about China, I think the fear of China is maybe exaggerated because Sri Lankans go to China because China offers money very cheaply. But that money has been misused by our governments because they take most of it and build some useless infrastructure projects. Now that is all, we see that problem. And I think that the Rajapaksas actually were closer to China than to India. India stepped in and helped us, and now we have a government that is not so close to the Chinese, to see the Chinese for what they are, and actually the present president wants very much to promote interconnectivity with India in every way. He's talking about a land bridge, a bridge across the sea.
No, I take your point that India has, in a way, rebuilt bridges with Sri Lanka. Raj Chengappa, the China factor, is that a cause for worry that you've got this big neighbor on our border and a neighbor which wants to expand its influence across these countries? We know of the Sino-Pakistan linkages, but now it's spreading, many believe, to across the neighborhood. Maldives is another good example of China's increasing sphere of influence. Should that be a cause of worry?
Well, China is already a cause of worry when it comes to our line of actual control. They had intrusions, and our relations are still abnormal, as the term that is used. It's a stalemate out there, and that, of course, is a huge cause of worry. With China, there's also examples. The way they went about doing the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of setting up and investing in infrastructure projects across the region in a way to replace India as the prime regional power, is something that India should learn from. India should, as he had mentioned in Sri Lanka, as soon as Sri Lanka went into trouble, India extended as much as $4 billion in assistance. That was more than what the IMF had given. So for the first time, as China began to spend big bucks, we began to spend it in terms of helping other countries. Now we need to take a leaf off China's book and actually build interdependencies. We saw what happened in Maldives, for instance, when President Muzu went with an India out policy and his ministers started criticizing us. We just raised the issue of saying boycott Maldives as a tourism spot. Now, as we know, Maldives depends heavily on tourism, and Indians were one of the largest tourist fraternity. The moment we said that, the rhetoric, anti-Indian rhetoric, began to come down. That's a negative way of looking. But if you take a positive view, and if you start building, as China did, a lot of interdependencies, and actually cash in on the fact that China created enormous debt. Instead, India has a very benign approach to it. We start connecting with, we actually have to give, if you remember the Gujral doctrine, you were there at that time, we need to give the neighbors more than what we can take and create a win-win, and that's going to make the difference.
Sure, but the perception of India in Bangladesh, for example, Sara, how does the average Bangladeshi view India now? Clearly not from the 1971 prism any longer. There's a completely new generation out there, but how do they see India? Particularly given what you said earlier on the show, that India didn't stand up against what Bangladeshis saw was a repressive regime. Would they support this kind of economic interdependence that Raj Chengappa here spoke of just now?
I think we have to recognize that, their interdependence is not really an option. It's an inevitability, and we need to have it to survive. I mean, given our geographical location and given everything else about Bangladesh, our size, what we produce, how we survive, but we obviously have to be linked to India, and we are in very many ways. And I think you're right to point out to this issue about generations. I think for older generations, including people like me who were very young during the Liberation War, our image of India is very different for many of us. It's definitely a reminder of friendship and connectivity and all of that. But I think for this younger generation that has grown up in the last sort of 15 to 20 years in particular, I think it is quite different, because they see a lot of exceptionalism being made in relation to India. They see a lot of political influence being wielded by India. And I think this, as I said, there's obviously you're talking about political influence. There's obviously massive cultural and social influence, massive integration in that sense, particularly between West Bengal and Bangladesh in terms of our literary and cultural and musical and other heritage. There's a huge amount of interconnection. You can't even think about segregating those things, really. But when it comes down to politics, I think it's a different situation. And people have seen, I think, with tremendous dismay, and that means including people from previous generations, this silence from India. Not only silence, I would go further and say complicity with many of the things that have been happening here that are not conscionable. And I think you said something earlier in the program that, is it time to stand by people, not just identify one individual that you're going to back to the hilt because it works in terms of geopolitical concerns, but think about, what are all of our, maybe it's naive to say this, but, all of our countries have certain foundational principles, which are about, equality, solidarity, dignity, dare I say it, human rights, the terms that most of our governments these days are not very happy to use any longer. But I think if we can remember that, then I think we can remember that within this region, we can build real solidarity amongst people. I don't think individual Bangladeshis have hatred for individual Indian people. I think there's a great deal of warmth. There's a great deal of existing relationships, friendships, and connections that we need to build. It's not simply about building economic relationships and trade relationships. It's much deeper than that. And I think we have to bring that back. It's going to be a hard run. It needs to happen, because I think we can't stay in a situation of isolation. But what we've just experienced over these last 15 plus years has, I think, created a great sense of alienation and a great sense of resentment, and we have to work through that.
In a sense, therefore, K.C. Singh, is there a message here, particularly for the Modi government, that you've got to be careful, you can't demonize communities, you've got to also get your act together at home to become more effective in this neighborhood, in a complex neighborhood? You've got to get your act together. You can't use polarizing legislation, you can't use polarizing rhetoric, you can't demonize communities, because then the notion of a Hindu Rashtra, for example, may again alienate parts of this neighborhood. Is that also a challenge in foreign policy as well?
That's a valid point, Rajdeep. I was thinking of that we haven't brought it up, that you can't have a majoritarian approach within the country. And don't forget, there's a deputy chief minister who's been let out after 2 years today by the Supreme Court. So it's not that we are the paragons of human rights and freedoms and so on and so forth. So there was a certain prism through which they were looking at Sheikh Hasina. She's seen as a secular bulwark against Islamism, which will then influence the whole of Northeast. So you gave her a long rope because it fitted in with your basic philosophy of how you want to view that country, rather than objectively viewing it and seeing that she's gone too far. And that is why the difficulty is more with Muslim majority countries. What did Moisu do? Because it becomes very difficult for a secular pro-India leader in a majority Muslim country to isolate his opponents. They come out and make an Islamic argument and say he's siding with India. But this is what is happening to Muslims in India.
So are we saying
that becomes a negative argument?
So are we saying, therefore, Sara, I'm giving you more time because as I said, Bangladesh has been the epicenter of it. Islamism, is that a fear in this neighborhood, this rising tide of Islamism as a counter almost to sort of rising Hindutva in India? Does that clash, as I come back to some of those images that we've seen out of Bangladesh this week, are disturbing for Indians?
They're disturbing, as I keep saying, for all of us, not just for Indians. They're disturbing for people in Bangladesh to see some of what we've seen in the last few days. But I think for Indians, I would imagine you're also very disturbed by the signs of minorities in India being lynched and attacked and all of that. I hope that would happen. We don't see those responses happening there. But just to go back to Mr. Singh, I think this issue about rising Islamism, I mean, is this not a self-fulfilling prophecy? If we are going to use, I deeply dread and have opposed all my life the politics of the Jamaat-e-Islami. But I don't think it's right to hold members of the Jamaat-e-Islami in secret detention centers for 8 and 9 years and deny that that is going on. That all that does is it breeds a sense of complete distrust and actually horror that things like that can happen. Because the point is, whether they're Islamists or not, they're human beings. And we have to show that you respect humanity. When you're showing that you actually just don't care about certain people because of their beliefs or the way they dress, what you do is you reinforce their understanding and their lack of trust in you. And that's what is giving the Islamists the greatest power and strength. They're coming back now to bite everybody because of what they've experienced.
Let's leave it there. As I said, I think over the last 50 minutes, we've looked at the complexities of the region. There are no easy solutions out there. From Pakistan to Afghanistan to Sri Lanka to Myanmar to Bangladesh, and dare I say to even us here in India, we haven't singled out, we haven't spoken of Nepal, and there's been turbulence there as well. We live in a turbulent neighborhood. You want to know more? You can, of course, read this cover story, Circle of Fire, in the latest India Today. It tells you all the worries and concerns and tensions that exist at the moment. I want to leave you with that on that point. I hope that we will have a more peaceful future for our children and the next generation, and be able to build the kind of economic interconnectedness that could well be the pathway to the future in South Asia. Thank you all, to all my guests, for joining me on this very special roundtable, and to you the viewers, Jai Hind, Namaskar.